Chapter 16. Glad indeed was Madeline to be lifted off her horse beside a roaring fire, to see steaming pots upon red-hot coals. Except about her shoulders, which was protected by the slicker, she was wringing wet. The Mexican women came quickly to help her change in a tent nearby, but Madeline preferred for the moment to warm her numb feet and hands and to watch the spectacle of her arriving friends. Dorothy plumped off her saddle into the arms of several waiting cowboys. She could scarcely walk. Far removed in appearance was from her usual stylish self. Her face was hidden by a limp and lopsided hat. From under the disheveled brim came a plaintive moan. "Oh, what an awful ride!" Miss Beck was in worse condition. She had to be taken off her horse. "I'm paralyzed. I'm a wreck. Bobby, get a rolling chair." Bobby was solicitous and willing, but there was no roller chairs. Florence dismounted easily, and but for her mass of hair, wet and tumbling, would have been taken for a handsome cowboy. Edith Wayne had stood the physical strain of the ride better than Dorothy. However, as her mount was rather small, she had been more at the mercy of cactus and brush. Her riding habit hung in tatters. Helen had persevered, a remnant of style, as well as pride, and perhaps a little strength. But her face was white, and her eyes were big, and she limped. "Majesty," she exclaimed, "what did you want us to do? Kill us outright, or make us homesick?" Of all them, however, Ambrose's wife, Kristen, the little French maid, had suffered the most of that long ride. She was unaccustomed to horses. Ambrose had to carry her into the big tent. Florence persuaded Madeline to leave the fire, and when they went in with the others, Dorothy was wailing because her wet boots would not come off. Miss Beck was weeping and trying to direct a Mexican woman to unfasten her bedraggled dress, and there was general pandemonium. "Warm clothes, hot drinks and grub, warm blankets," rang out Stewart's sharp orders. And then, with Florence helping the Mexican women, it was not long until Madeline and the feminine side of the party were comfortable, except for the weariness and the aches that only rest and sleep would alleviate. Neither fatigue nor pains, however, nor the strangeness of being packed sardine-like under canvas, nor the howling of coyotes kept Madeline's guests from stretching out with long grateful sighs, and one by one dropped into deep slumber. Madeline whispered a little to Florence, and laughing with her once or twice, and then the light flickering on the canvas faded, and her eyelids closed. Darkness and roar of camp life, low voices of men, thumps of horses' hoofs and coyotes running, and the sense of warmth and sweet rest, all drifted away. When she awoke, shadows of swaying branches moved on the sunlit canvas above her. She heard the ringing strokes of an axe, but no other sound from outside. Slow, regular breathing attested to the deep slumber of her tent compadres. She observed presently that Florence was missing from the number. Madeline rose and peeped out between the flaps. A beautiful scene surprised and enthralled her gaze. She saw a level space, green with long grass, bright with flowers, dotted with groves of graceful firs and pines and spruces, reaching to superb crags, and rosy and golden in the sunlight. Eager to get out there where she could enjoy an unrestricted view, she searched for her pack and found it in a corner, and then hurriedly and quietly got dressed. Her favorite staghounds, Russ and Tartar, were asleep before the door where they had been chained. She awoken them and loosed them, thinking the while that it must have been Stewart who had chained them nearby. Close at hand, also, was a cowboy's bedroll that was rolled up in a tarp. The cool air, fragrant with pine and spruce, and some subtle, nameless tang, sweet and tonic, made Madeline stand erect and breathe slowly and deeply. It was like drinking of a magic draught. She felt it in her blood that quickened its flow. Turning to look in the other direction beyond the tent, she saw the remnants of last night's temporary camp, and further, on a grove of beautiful pine from which came the sharp ring of the axe. A wider gaze took in a wonderful peak, and not only surrounded by lofty crags, but full of crags of lesser height, many lifting their heads from dark green groves of trees. The morning sun, not yet above the eastern elevations, sent its rosy and golden shafts in between the towering rocks tipped to the pines. Madeline, with the hounds beside her, walked through the nearest grove. The ground was soft and springy and brown with pine needles, and then she saw that a clump of trees had prevented her from seeing the most striking part of this natural park. The cowboys had selected a campsite where they would have the morning sun and afternoon shade. Several tents and flies had been up already. There was a huge lean-to made of spruce boughs, and cowboys were busy round about several campfires. Piles of packs lay covered with tarps, and beds were rolled up under the trees. This space was kind of a rolling meadow, with isolated trees here and there, and other trees in aisles and circles. It mounted in low, grassy banks to great towers of stone 50 to 500 feet high. Other crags rose behind these, and from under a mossy cliff, huge and green and cool, bubbled a full, clear spring. Wild flowers fringed its banks. Out in the meadow, the horses were knee-deep in grass that waved in the morning breeze. Florence spied Madeline under the trees and came running. She was like a young girl with life and color and joy. She wore a flannel blouse, a corduroy skirt, and moccasins, and her hair was fastened under a band like an Indian's. "Castleton's gone with a gun, for hours it seems," said Florence. "Jean just went up to hunt for him. The other gentlemen are still asleep. I'm sure they'll sleep in this air." Then, businesslike, Florence fell into questioning Madeline about the details of camp arrangements which Stuart and Florence herself could hardly see to without suggestion. Before any of Madeline's sleepy guests awoke, the camp was completed. Madeline and Florence had a tent under a pine tree, but they did not intend to sleep in it, except during stormy weather. They spread a tarp and made their bed on it, elected to sleep under the light of the stars. After that, taking the hounds with them, they explored. To Madeline's surprise, the park was not a half-mile nook nestling among the crags, but extended further than they cared to walk, and was rather a series of parks. They were no more than small valleys between gray-toothed peaks. As the day advanced, the charm of the place grew upon Madeline. Even at noon, with the sun beating down, there was a comfortable warmth rather than heat. It was that kind of warmth that Madeline liked to feel in the spring, and the sweet, thin, rare atmosphere began to affect her strangely. She breathed deeply of it until she felt light-headed, as if her body lacked substance and might drift away like a thistledown. All at once, she grew uncomfortably sleepy. A dreamy languor possessed her, and laying under a pine with her head against Florence, she went to sleep. And when she opened her eyes, the shadows of the crags stretched from the west, and between them steamed a red gold light. It was a hazy, smoky sunshine, losing its fire. The afternoon had far advanced, and Madeline sat up. Florence was lazily reading away. The two Mexican women were at work under the fly where the big stone fireplace had been erected. No one else was in sight. Florence, upon being questioned, informed Madeline That incident before camp had been delightfully absent. Castleton had returned and was profoundly sleeping with the other men. Presently, a chorus of merry calls attracted Madeline's attention, and she turned to see Helen limping along with Dorothy and Miss Beck and Edith supporting each other. They were all rested, but lame, and delighted with the place, and hungry as bears awoken from a winter sleep. Madeline forthwith escorted them round the camp, and through the many aisles between the trees into the mossy, pine-matted nooks among the crag. Then they had dinner, sitting on the ground after the manner of the Indians, and it was dinner that lacked merriment only because everyone was too busy appeasing their appetite. Later, Stuart led them across a neck of the park, up a rather steep climb between two towering crags, and take them out upon a grassy promenade that faced the great open west. A vast ridge streaking in reddened sweep of earth rolled down, as it seemed, to the golden sunset at the end of the world. Castleton said it was a jolly fine view, and Dorothy voiced her usual enthusiasm. Helen was on fire with pleasure and wonder. Miss Beck appealed to Bobby to see how he liked it before she ventured, and then she reiterated his praise. And Edith Wayne, like Madeline and Florence, were silent. Boyd was politely interested. He was the kind of man who appeared to care things as other people cared for them. Madeline watched the slow transformation of the changing west, with its haze of desert dust, through which mountain and cloud and sun slowly darkened. She watched until her eyes ached and scarcely had a thought of what she was watching, with her eyes shifting to encounter the tall form of Stuart standing motionless on the rim. Her mind became active again. As usual, he stood apart from the others, and now he seemed aloof and unconscious. He made a dark, powerful figure, and he fit that wild landscape. She experienced a strange, annoying surprise when she discovered both Helen and Dorothy were watching Stuart with interest. Edith, too, was alive to the splendid picture of the cowboy. But when Edith smiled and whispered in her ear, "It's so good to look at a man like that," Madeline again felt the surprise, only this time the accompaniment was a vague pleasure rather than annoyance. Helen and Dorothy were flirts, one deliberate and skilled, the other unconscious and natural. Edith Wayne occasionally, and Madeline reflected that the occasions were infrequent, admired a man sincerely. Just here Madeline might have fallen into somewhat a revealing state of mind if it had not been for the fact that she believed Stuart was only an object of deep interest to her, not as a man, but as part of this wild and wonderful West which was claiming her. So she did not inquire of herself why Helen's quandary and Dorothy's lavish allurement annoyed her, or Edith's eloquent smile and words had pleased her. She got as far, however, as to think scornfully of how Helen and Dorothy would welcome and meet a flirtation with this cowboy and then go back home and forget him as utterly as if he never existed. She wondered, too, with a curious twist of feelings that was almost eagerness, how the cowboy would meet their advances. Obviously, the situation was unfair to him, and if by some strange accident he escaped the unscathed by Dorothy's beautiful eyes, he would never be able to withstand Helen's subtle and fascinating and impervious personality. They returned to camp in the cool of the evening and made merry round of the blazing campfire. But Madeline's guests soon succumbed to the persistent and irresistible desire of sleep. Then Madeline went to bed with Florence under the pine tree. Ross lay upon one side and Tartar upon the other. The cool night breeze swept over her, fanning her face, waving her hair. It was not strong enough to make any sound through the branches, but it stirred a faint, silken rustle in the long grass. The cowboys began their weird bark and howl, and Russ raised his head and growled at them. Madeline faced upward, and it seemed to her that under those wonderful white stars she would never be able to go to sleep. They blinked down through the black, barred, delicate crisscross of pine foliage, and they looked so big and so close. And then she gazed away to open space where an expanse of sky glittered with stars, and the longer she gazed, the larger they grew and the more she saw. It was her belief that she had come to love all the physical things from which sensations of beauty and mystery and strength poured into her mind. But best of all, she loved these western stars, for they were to have something to do with her life, were somehow to influence her destiny. For a few days, the prevailing features of camp life for Madeline's guests were sleep and rest. Dorothy Combs slept through 24 hours, and then was so difficult to awaken that for a while her friends were quite alarmed. Helen had almost fell asleep while eating and talking. These men were more visibly affected by the mountain air than the women. Castleton, however, would not succumb to the strange drowsiness which he had a chance to prowl around with a gun hunting. This spell disappeared presently, and then the days were full of life and action. Miss Beck and Bobby and Boyd, however, did not go in for anything more strenuous. Edith Wayne, too, preferring to walk through the groves or sit upon the grassy meadow. It was Helen and Dorothy who wanted to explore the crags and canyons, and when they could not get the others to accompany them, they went alone, giving the cowboys guiding them a merry long climb. Necessarily, of course, Madeline and her guests were now thrown much in company with the cowboys, and the party grew to be much like one big family. Her friends not only adapted themselves admirably to the situation, but came to revel in it. As for Madeline, she saw that outside of a certain proclivity of the cowboys to be gallant and on dress parade and alive to possibilities of fun and excitement, they were not greatly different from when they were at all times. If they were a level process here, it was made by her friends coming down to meet the Westerners. Besides, any class of people would tend to grow natural in such circumstance and environment. Madeline found the situation one of keen and of double interest for her. If before her she had cared to study her cowboy's particular Stuart now, with the contrastings afforded to her by her guests, she felt by turns that she was amused and mystified and perplexed and saddened, and then again subtly pleased. Monty, once he had overcome his shyness, became a source of delight to Madeline, and for that matter to everybody. Monty had suddenly discovered that he was a success among the ladies. Either he was exalted to heroic heights by this knowledge, or he made it appear so. Dorothy had been his undoing, and in justice to her, Madeline believed her innocent. Dorothy thought Monty hideous to look at, and accordingly, as if he had been a hero 100 times and had saved 100 poor little babies' lives, he could not have been interested in her. Monty followed her round, reminding her. She told Madeline of some little adorning dog one moment, and the next of a huge devouring gorilla. Nels and Nick stalled and walked behind Helen's heels like grenadiers on duty, and if she so much as dropped her glove, they almost came to blow to see who would pick it up. In a way, Castleton was the best feature of the camping party. He was such an absurd-looking little man, and his abilities were at such tremendous odds with what might have been expected of him from his looks. He could ride, and tramp, and climb, and shoot. He liked to help around the camp, and the cowboys could not keep him from it. He had an insatiable desire to do things that were new to him, and the cowboys played innumerable tricks upon him, not one of which he ever discovered. He was serious and slow in speech and action, and absolutely impenetrable. If impredibility could have been good humor, then he was always in good humor. Presently the cowboys began to understand him, and then to like him. When they liked a man, it meant something. Madeline had been sorry more than once to see how little the cowboys chose to speak to Boyd Harvey. With Castleton, however, they actually became friends. They did not know it, and certainly such a thing never occurred to him. All the same, it was a fact. And it grew solely out of the truth that the Englishman was manly in the only ways cowboys could have interpreted manliness. When, after innumerable attempts, he succeeded in throwing the diamond hitch upon a pack horse, the cowboys began to respect him. Castleton needed only one more accomplishment to claim their hearts, and he kept trying that, to ride a bucking bronco. One of the cowboys had a bronco that they called Devil. Every day for a week, Devil threw the Englishman all over that park, ruining his clothes and bruising him, and finally kicked him. Then the cowboys tried to make Castleton give up, and this was remark enough, for the spectacle of an English lord on a bucking bronco was one that any Westerner would have ridden 1,000 miles to see. Whenever Devil threw Castleton, the cowboys went into spasms. But Castleton did not know the meaning of the word fail, and there came a day when Devil could not throw him. Then it was a singular sight to see the men line up to shake hands with the cool Englishman. Even Stuart, who had been watching from the background, came forward with a warm and pleasant smile upon his dark face. When Castleton went to his tent, there was more characteristic talk of cowboy, and this time it was vastly different from the former persiflage. "By God," ejected Monty Price, who seemed to be the most amazed and elated of them all, "that's the first Englishman I ever seen. He's hardly deceiving to look at, but I know now why England decided to try and rule the world. Just take a peek at that bronco. His spirits is broken. Rid by a little English duke with no bigger'n a grasshopper. Fellers, if it ain't dawned on you yet, let Monty Price give you a hunch. There's no flies on Castleton, and I'd bet $1,000,000 steers to a rawhide rope that next he'll be throwing a gun as good as nails." It was a distinct pleasure for Madeline to realize that she liked Castleton all the better for the traits brought out so forcibly by his association with the cowboys. On the other hand, she liked the cowboys better for something in them that contact with Easterners had brought out. This was especially true in Stuart's case. She had been wholly wrong when she imagined he would fall an easy victim to Dorothy's eyes and Helen's lures. He was kind, helpful, courteous, and watchful, but he had no sentiment. He did not see Dorothy's charms or feel Helen's fascinations, and their efforts to captivate him were now so obvious that Miss Beck taunted them, and Edith smiled knowingly, and Bobby and Boyd made playful remarks, all of which cut Helen's pride and hurt Dorothy's vanity. They made an open conquest of Stuart. So it came about that Madeline unconsciously admitted the cowboy to a place in her mind that never occupied by any other. The instant it occurred to her why he was proof against the wiles of other women, she drove that amazing and strange disturbing thought from her head. Nevertheless, as she was human, she could not help thinking and being pleased and enjoying a little the discomfort of the two concords. Moreover, from this thought of Stuart and the watchfulness of growing out of it, she discovered more about him. He was not happy. He often paced up and down the grove at night. He absented himself from camp sometimes during the afternoon when Nels and Nick and Monty were there. He was always watching the trails, as if he expected to see someone come riding up. He alone of the cowboys did not indulge in the fun and talk around the campfire. He remained preoccupied and sad, and was always looking into the distance. Madeline had a sense of strange of his guardianship over her. and remembering Don Carlos, she imagined he worried a good deal over his charge, and indeed over the safety of all the party. But if he did worry about possible visits from guerrillas, why did he absent himself from camp? Suddenly, into Madeline's mind flashed a remembrance of the dark-eyed Mexican girl Benita, who had never been heard of since that night she rode Stuart's big horse out of El Cajon. The remembrance of her brought an idea. Perhaps Stuart had a rendezvous in the mountain, and those lonely trips of his were to meet Benita. With the idea, hot blood flamed into Madeline's cheeks. Then she was amazed at her own feelings. Amazed because her swiftness succeeded thought was to deny the idea. Amazed that its conception had fired her cheeks with shame. And then her old self, the one aloof with this red-blooded newness, gained control over her emotions. But Madeline found that newborn self a creature of strange power to return and govern at any moment. She found it fighting loyalty for what intelligence and wisdom told her was only her romantic conception of a cowboy. She reasoned. If Stuart were the kind of man her feminine skepticism wanted to make him, he would not have been so blind to the advances of Helen and Dorothy. He had once been. She did not want to recall what he had once been, but he had been uplifted. Madeline Hammond declared that. She was swayed by a strong, beating pride, and her instinctive woman's faith told her that he could not stoop to such dishonor. She reproached herself for having such a momentary thought of it. One afternoon, a huge storm cloud swooped down out of the sky and enveloped the crags. It obscured the westerning sun and laid a mantle of darkness up over the park. Madeline was uneasy because of several of her party, including Dorothy and Helen, had ridden off with the cowboys that afternoon and had not returned. Florence assured her that even if they did not get back before the storm broke, there would be no reason for apprehension. Nevertheless, Madeline sent for Stuart and asked him to go or send one of the others to search for them. Perhaps a half an hour later, Madeline heard the welcoming patter of the hooves on the trail. The big tent was brightly lit with several lanterns. Edith and Florence were with her. It was so dark outside that Madeline could not see a rod before her face, and the wind was moaning in the trees, and big drops of rain were pelting upon the canvas. Presently, just inside the door, the horses halted, and there was a sharp bustle of sound, such as would naturally result from a hurried dismounting and confusion in the dark. Miss Beck come running into the tent out of breath and radiant because they had beaten the storm. Helen entered next, and a little later came Dorothy, but long enough to make her entrance more noticeable. The instant Madeline saw Dorothy's blazing eyes, she knew something unusual had happened. Whatever it was might have escaped comment had not Helen caught sight of Dorothy. "Heavens, Dotty, but you're handsome occasionally," remarked Helen, "when you get some life in your face and eyes." Dorothy turned her face away from the others, and perhaps it was only accident that she looked into a mirror hanging on the tent wall. Swiftly, she put her hand up to feel a wide welt on her cheek. Dorothy had been careful of her soft white skin, and here an ugly mark marred its beauty. "Look at that!" she cried in distress. "My complexion's ruined." "How'd you get such a splotch?" inquired Helen, coming closer. "I've been kissed," exclaimed Dorothy dramatically. "What?" inquired Helen more curiously while the others laughed. "I've been kissed and hugged and kissed by one of those shameless cowboys. It was so pitch dark outside I could not see a thing, and so noisy I couldn't hear, but someone was trying to help me off my horse, and my foot caught in the stirrup, and away I went right into somebody's arms, and then he did it, that wrench. He hugged and kissed me in a most awful bearish manner. I couldn't even budge a finger. I'm simply boiling with rage." When the outburst of mirth subsided, Dorothy turned her big, dilated eyes upon Florence.
Did those cowboys really take advantage of a girl when she was helpless and in the dark?
Of course they do, replied Florence in her frank smile.
Dot, what in the world would you expect? Asked Helen. Haven't you been dying to be kissed?
No.
Well, you've been acting like it then. I never before saw you in such a rage over being kissed. I wouldn't care so much if the brute hadn't scoured up my face with his whiskers. They're so sharp and stiff as sandpaper, and when I jerked away he rubbed my cheek with them.
This revelation as to the cause of her outraged dignity almost prostrated her friends with glee.
Dot, I agree with you. It's one thing to be kissed and quite another to have your beauty spoiled, replied Helen. Who was this particular savage? I don't know, burst out Dorothy. If I did, I'd...
Her eyes expressed the dire punishment she could not speak.
Honest now, Dot, haven't you the least idea who did it? Questioned Helen. I hope it was Stuart, replied Dorothy. Oh, Dotty, your hope is farther than the thought. My dear, I'm sorry to riddle your little romance. Stuart did not and could not have been the offender or a hero. And how do you know he couldn't? Demanded Dorothy, flushing. Because he was clean-shaven today at noon, before we rode out. I remember perfectly how nice and smooth and brown his face looked. Oh, do you? Well, if your memories for faces is so good, maybe you could tell me which one of those cowboys wasn't clean-shaven. Well, it's merely a matter of elimination, replied Helen merrily. It wasn't Nick, and it wasn't Nels, and it wasn't Frankie. And there's only one other cowboy with us, and he was short, and he had a stubble length of beard, much like the cactus we passed on the trail. Oh, I was afraid of that, moaned Dorothy. I knew he was going to do it. It was that horrible little smiling demon Monty Price.
A favorite lounging spot of Madeline's was a shaded niche under the lee of crags facing the east. Here, the outlook was entirely different from that on the western side. It was not red and white and glaring. It was not so changeable that it taxed attention. This eastern view was one of the mountains and the valleys, where, to be sure, there were arid patches, but the restful green of pine and fir were there, and the cool gray of the crags. Behold, and rugged indeed were those mountain features, yet they were companionably close, and not immeasurable distant, and unattainable like the desert. Here in the shade of the afternoon, Madeline and Edith would often lounge under a low-branched tree. Seldom they talked much, for it was afternoon, and dreamy with the strange spell of this mountain fastness. There was a smoky haze in the valleys, a fleecy cloud resting upon the peaks, and a sailing eagle in the blue sky, silence that was unbroken in the wild heights, and a soft wind laden with the incense of pine. One afternoon, however, Edith appeared prone to talk seriously.
Majesty, I must be getting home soon. I cannot stay out here forever. Are you going back with me? Well, maybe, replied Madeline thoughtfully. I have considered it. I should have to visit home sometime, but this summer Mother and Father are going to Europe. See here, Majesty Hammond, do you intend to spend the rest of your life out here in this wilderness? Asked Edith bluntly.
Madeline was silent.
Oh, it's glorious. Don't misunderstand me, dear, went on Edith earnestly as she laid hand upon Madeline's. This trip has been a revelation to me. I did not tell you, Majesty, that I was ill when I arrived, and now I'm well, so well. Look at Helen, too. Why, she was a ghost when we got here, and now she's brown and strong and beautiful. If it were for nothing else than this wonderful gift of health, I would love the West. But I've come to love it for the other things, the spiritual things. Majesty, I've been studying you. I see and feel what this life has made of you. When I came, I wondered at your strength and your virility, your serenity, your happiness, and I was stunned. I wondered at the cause of your changes, and now I know. You were sick of idleness, sick of uselessness, if not society, sick of the horrible smells and noises and contacts one can no longer escape in the cities. And I'm sick of that too. And I could tell you many women of our kind who suffer in the like manner. You've done what many of us wanted to do, but did not have the courage, and you've left it. I'm not blind to the splendid difference you've made in your life. I think I would have discovered, even if your brother had not told me, what good you've done to the Mexicans and cattlemen on your ranch. But then you have work to do. There is much secret in your happiness, is it not? Tell me something of what it means to you. Well, there's the work, of course. Has much to do with anyone's happiness. No one can be happy when there's no work. As regards to myself, for the rest I can hardly tell you. I've never tried putting it into words, and frankly I believe if I had not money, I could not have found such contentment here. That is not any sense of judgment against the West, but if I had been poor, I could not have bought and maintained my ranch. Stillwell, he tells me that there's many larger ranches than mine, but none just like it. And then I am almost paying my expenses out of my business. Think of that. My income, instead of being wasted, is mostly saved. I long to be useful. I have been of some little good to the Mexicans, easing the hardships of the few cowboys, and for the rest I think my life is kind of a dream. Of course, my ranch and range are real, and the cowboys are typical. If I were to tell you how I feel about them, it would simply be a story of how Madeline Hammond sees the West. They are true to the West. It is I who am strange, and what I feel for them may be strange too, Edith, to hold in your impressions. But, Majesty, my impressions have changed. At first I did not like the wind, the dust, the sun, the endless open stretches, but now I love them. Where once I saw only terrible wastes of barren ground, now I see beauty and something noble. Then at first your cowboys struck me as dirty and rough, and loud, crude, and savage, all that was primitive. I did not want them near me. I imagined them callous and hard men, their only joy a carouse with their own kind. But I was wrong. I have changed. The dirt was only dust, and this desert dust is clean. They were still rough, loud, and crude, and savage in my eyes, but what is the difference? They're natural men. They are like little children. Monty Price is one of the nature's noblemen. The hard thing is to discover. All of his hideous person, all of his actions and speech, are all masks of his true nature. Nels is a joy, a simple, sweet, kind, quiet man whom some women should have loved. What would love have meant to him? He told me that no woman has ever loved him except his mother, and he lost her when he was 10. Every man ought to be loved, especially a man such as Nels. Somehow his gun record, it does not impress me. I could never believe he killed a man. Then now take your foreman Stewart. He is a cowboy, his work and life the same as the others, but he has education and much of the graces that we are in the habit of saying make a gentleman. Stewart is a strange fellow, but just like this strange land. He's a man, Majesty, and I admire him. So you see, my impressions are developing with my stay out here. Edith, I'm so glad you told me that, replied Madeline. I like this country, and I like the men, went on Edith. One reason I want to go home soon is because I'm discontented enough at home now without falling in love with the West. Of course, Madeline, I would. I could not live out here, and that brings me to my point. Omitting all the beauty and charm and wholesome and good of this wonderful country. Still, it's no place for you, Madeline Hammond. You have your position, your wealth, your name, and your family. You must marry, you must have children. You must not give up all that for a life in the wilderness. I'm convinced, Edith, that I'll live out here the rest of my life. Oh, Majesty, I hate to preach this way, but I promised your mother I would talk to you. And the truth is I hate what I'm saying. I envy you in your courage and wisdom. I know you have refused to marry Boyd Harvey. I could see that in his face. I believe you'll also refuse Castleton. Who will you marry? What chance is there for a woman of your position to marry out here? What in the world will become of you? Of me? Replied Madeline with a smile that was almost sad.
Not so many hours after this conversation with Edith, Madeline sat with Boyd Harvey upon the grass meadow overlooking the west, and she looked once again to his swayed courtship. Suddenly she turned to him and said, "Boyd, if I married you, would you be willing, glad to spend the rest of your life out here in the West?"
"Majesty," he explained.
There was amaze in the voice, usually so even and well modulated, amaze in the handsome face that was usually so indifferent. Her question had startled him. She saw him look down at the iron grey cliffs, upon the barren slopes and cedared ridges, upon the cactus-covered foothills that to the grim and ghastly desert. Just then, with its red veil of sunlight, dust clouds, its waste of ruin and upheavaled earth, it was a spectacular sight.
"No,"
he replied, and with a tinge of shame in his cheek. Madeline said no more, nor did he speak. She was spared the pain of refusing him, and she imagined he would never again ask. There was both relief and regret in the conviction. Humiliated lovers seldom made good friends. It was impossible not to like Boyd Harvey. The thought of that, and why she could not marry him, concentrated the never-satisfying mind upon the man, and she looked at him, and she thought of him. He was handsome, young, rich, well-born, pleasant, cultivated. He had all that made a gentleman of his class. If he had any vices, she had not heard of them. She knew he had no thirst of drink or craze of gambling. He was a considerably desirable and eligible young man. Madeline admitted all that. Then she thought of things that were perhaps elusive to her own strange ideas. Boyd Harvey's white skin did not tan even in this southwest sun and wind. His hands were whiter than her own, and as soft. They were quite beautiful, and she remembered what care he took of them. They were a proof that he had never worked. His frame was tall and graceful and elegant. It did not bear evidence of any ruggedness. He had never indulged in any sport more strenuous than yachting. He hated effort and activity. He rode bareback very little and disliked any but moderate motoring. Spent much time in Newport and Europe. Never walked when he could help it, and had no ambition until it was past the day's pleasantry. If he had ever had any sons, they'd be like him, only a generation more towards the inevitable distinction of his race. Madeline returned to camp, in just the mood to make a sharp, deciding contrast. It happened, fatefully perhaps, that the first man she saw was Stewart. He had just ridden into camp, and as she came up, he explained that he had gone down to the ranch for the important mail which she had been expressing anxiety for.
"Down and back in a day," she exclaimed.
"Yeah," he replied. "It wasn't so bad."
"But why didn't you send one of the boys and let him take a regular 2-day trip?"
"You was worried about your mail," he answered briefly as he delivered it, and then he bent to examine the feet of his weary horse. It It was midsummer now, Madeline reflected, and exceedingly hot and dusty on the lower trail. Stuart had ridden down the mountain and back again in 12 hours. Probably no horse in the outfit except his big black or Majesty could have stood to that kind of trip. And his horse showed the effects of a grueling day. He was caked with dust and lame and weary. Stuart looked as if he had spared the horse his weight on many a mile on that rough ascent. His boots were evidence of it. His heavy flannel shirt, wet with the perspiration, adhered close to his shoulders and arms so that every ripple of muscle showed plainly. His face was black except round the temples and forehead, where it was bright red. Drops of sweat running off his blackened hands dripped to the ground. He got up from examining the lame foot, and then threw off the saddle. The black horse snorted and lunged for the watering pool. Stuart let him drink a little, and then with iron arms dragged him away. This action, the man's lithe, powerful form impressed Madeline with a wonderful sense of muscular force. His brawny wrist was bare, his big, strong hand, the first clutching the horse's mane, then patting his neck, had a bruised knuckle, and one finger was bound up. That hand expressed as much gentleness and thoughtfulness for the horse as it had strength to drag him back from having too much to drink at a dangerous moment. Stuart was a combination of fire and strength and action. These attributes seemed to cling about him. There was something vital and compelling about his presence. Worn and spent and drawn as he was from the long ride, he thrilled Madeline with his potential youth and unused vitality and promise of things to be, the red-blooded deeds both of flesh and spirit. In him she saw the strength of his forefathers unimpaired. The life of him was marvelous and spectacular. The dust and the dirt and the sweat and the soiled clothes, the bruised and bandaged hand, the brawn and the bone, these had not been despised by the knights of ancient days, nor by the modern women whose eyes shed soft light upon coarse and bloody toilers. Madeline Hammond compared the man of the East with this man of the West, and that comparison was the last parting regret of her old standard. End of chapter 16.